Well, hello and welcome to my channel, The Withered Fig Tree. My name is Randy Silva, and I've been doing live streams about the importance of the Holy Spirit in the lives of Christians. And the current series that we're doing is called The History of Judaism. And this is part 8, the final episode of that series. Let's go ahead and get started. So the title of the episode, part 8, is From the Talmud to Modern Times. So we're going to make it all the way up until modern times from around 600 AD, which is where we left off last week. The central question of this series is, how does Judaism still exist today? In a way, it's a bit surprising. I'm not saying that I'm happy about it or not happy about it or anything like that. What I am saying is that the Jews went through many sequences of just terrible times, almost to the point of extinction at various times, and yet it still exists today. It's really about their stalwartness and it's about their perseverance. Now, we began all the way back in the Garden of Eden with the creation of a special human line, the Adamic line, and the loss of the indwelling Holy Spirit after the fall. We trace that line through early humanity to Noah in a world marked by corruption and also these special unusual entities, the Nephilim, which is the Hebrew word for the fallen ones, and that culminated in the flood and the preservation of Noah's family. Now, after Noah, we continued to Abraham, through whom God established a distinct nation, promising land and covenantal relationship. And we followed Abraham's descendants to Egypt, where Joseph rose to power, and Israel grew into a nation within Egypt until they were enslaved. Now, through Moses, God delivered Israel and gave the law the first time when they entered the desert before they were wandered. He established them in the land after, they wandered for 40 years, and then it was Joshua who went across with the next generation of people, and they were given the law a second time by Moses before he passed away. He didn't get to enter the land. They first were ruled by a series of judges, whom God raised up a bunch of judges, but then the nation wanted to be a kingdom, and so they wanted a king, and so they became a kingdom. They built the temple in Jerusalem. They were divided into northern and southern nations, so into two nations, and ultimately each nation was exiled. Israel, the northern kingdom, in 722 BC, and Judah, the southern kingdom, in 586 BC. And it was at that time, 586 BC, where this temple was destroyed by the Babylonians. After the exile, some of the Jews returned and rebuilt the temple in 513 BC, so that is what we call the Second Temple. But they remained under foreign powers until the time of Jesus. We spoke about the Seleucid Empire in the 2nd century BC, about how they had a war, the Maccabean War. Many Jews died, many were enslaved. The temple was not destroyed, but it was turned into a brothel, and pork was cooked on the altar by Antiochus IV. And that was in the 2nd century BC. But the Jews, through the Maccabean War, miraculously won. And then Romans took control of the land in 63 BC. That is the time of Jesus. Jesus was probably born around 4 BC, and he was crucified and rose from the dead around 30 AD. And Christians see Jesus as the fulfillment of the Abrahamic promise, inaugurating a new covenant and, most importantly, restoring the indwelling Holy Spirit. Now, from 30 to 70 AD, we saw that the Jews encountered this message of Christianity, but after most rejected it, the temple, this second one, was destroyed in 70 AD by the Romans, and the nation was shattered. With that war, the first war, as well as two other Jewish-Roman wars. Now, Rabbinic Judaism then emerged, and it stabilized itself through a book called the Mishnah, which was around 200 AD. The Mishnah is largely a preservation of the Pharisaic oral traditions. After the destruction of the temple, the Pharisaic approach to the law essentially became the dominant form of Judaism. Christianity became the religion of the Roman Empire around the 4th century. We talked about that in the History of Christianity series. Yet the last non-Christian emperor, his name was Julian the Apostate. He was the emperor from 361 to 363 AD, and he was the exception. He was the only non-Christian emperor in that time. And he attempted with the Jews to rebuild the temple in 361 AD, but that effort failed, and it was widely seen as being divinely thwarted. And then we saw the Talmuds and the commentary, which are the commentaries to the Mishnah. They were written, there was two of them, they were written in the 4th and 6th centuries, and they form the foundation of Judaism as it exists today. So there we go. That's a good review of episodes 1 through 7. Now we can talk about modern Judaism and things that happened between the writing of the two Talmuds up until the present time. Okay, so first I wanted to talk about this slide is called Restoring Judaism, the Passive Posture. So what was going to happen to Judaism after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD? From a Christian standpoint, we could see that as God saying Judaism, the Old Covenant, is now, that chapter is now complete, and now a new chapter is going forward, Christianity, that is the Christian perspective. But now what would the Jews do, since almost 1/3 of the laws of the Old Covenant, the 613 laws of the Old Covenant, required a temple to exist, and now it doesn't exist. What I want to describe here is sort of like a philosophy or a trend or a mindset of how the Jews would go on and how it was shaped from their earlier history. So the first thing you'll see is that they had a loss of the Ark of the Covenant, the loss of the monarchy, and the loss of the prophetic center that shifted from Israel away from the direct covenantal administration. Now, if you want more information about the loss of the Ark of the Covenant, you can see episode 10 of the prior series, the 7 Spirits of Revelation. But what that talks about is how the Ark had disappeared sometime between 622 and 586 BC. And the Ark of the Covenant was never rebuilt. It was the center of the temple. It was the part of the law described how on Yom Kippur the high priest would do a sacrifice for the sins of the people, and what would happen with the ark being gone. Well, the answer was they never rebuilt the ark, and instead they used the stone that it used to sit on, and they used that in its place. And so in the second temple that was rebuilt in 513 BC, there's never a mention of the Ark of the Covenant being there, and we see in the Mishnah that it was said that it was never there. Instead, it was just the stone. So they lose the Ark, they lose the monarchy at the exiles, and they lose this prophetic center. We know that, and they even recognize that the prophets the major and minor prophets, those ended in the 400 BCs. So how are they going to continue? Well, the exile taught the Jews to preserve identity under judgment and foreign rule. So first they lose the ark, but they continue. But then they have the exile, and in the exile, they're not even in the land. The temple was destroyed, and they're not even in the land, but they learn to preserve their identity under this judgment from God as they saw it, as it was, and the foreign rule. Now, the Second Temple partially restored their national religious life, but not the old order in full. So they didn't receive the monarchy. They didn't have any judges, as it were. They had more prophets that were talking about things like this Second Temple is going to be destroyed, and talking about the Messiah who would come. Basically talking about how there would be further judgment until the Messiah, and even after the Messiah, for the Jewish people. Now, after 70 AD, the Rabbinic Judaism turned from sacrifice to text, memory, law, and community. So they realized that they could not rebuild the temple. There were no prophecies about rebuilding the temple. And so just like they hadn't rebuilt the ark, just like they hadn't restored the monarchy, just like they hadn't come up with new prophets, they shifted away from that and went into Rabbinic Judaism. So Judaism that goes through, or comes from, goes through is probably a better word, the rabbis through into their community, and also through what they refer to as sages. And those are basically just very wise rabbis. It's created a durable posture of waiting, interpretation, and survival. And that posture was adaptive and historically impressive. That's my viewpoint of it. Historically impressive that they could go through so much change, so much tragedy, so many terrible times, but still can still sit there waiting and interpreting what they had in the Old Testament and in the Mishnah. But it also meant that Judaism was increasingly functioned apart from the original temple-centered design. So without the temple, they would have to then focus on the laws that existed at that point that could still be followed. And those, for the most part, were the laws about the Sabbath, the laws about how they would eat, so the dietary laws. And you could also see the custom laws in terms of things like holidays, but even those had to be changed because those were all centered around the temple, and so they would have to redesign how they would celebrate these holidays. Put here that thus Rabbinic Judaism is analogous to the exile in spirit. So it's analogous to how they continued their Judaism, like when you read Daniel and how did he continue to be a Jew when he was exiled in Babylon. They continued that spirit, but it wasn't identical to this covenantal structure because there wasn't this idea of returning to the monarchy, rebuilding the ark, rebuilding the temple, and so forth. Going to this time period after the writing of the Talmud, call it post-Talmudic Judaism, codification, mysticism, survival, and modern fracture. So there's this Geonic period, they call it, from 600 AD to 1038. And this is where Babylonian rabbinic leadership consolidated the authority of the Talmud and answered legal questions across the Jewish world about how they were going to continue their Judaism. And then in medieval times, you have medieval Jewish philosophy. Maimonides, they systemized belief and law, especially with his legal writings and his influential book that he wrote called 13 Principles. You also have the Ashkenazi development. This was Jewish life in Northern Europe. It developed its own distinctive customs, liturgy, and legal traditions that differed from the Sephardic practice outside of south of Europe and in the Middle East area. They have the Kabbalah, so it's Jewish mysticism expanded, especially in medieval Spain and later Safed, giving exile, creation, and redemption a cosmic dimension. I can't really say that I'm well versed in what the Kabbalah is, but it is certainly a different way of looking at the Old Testament and the Old Covenant with its own set of writings, and it has to do with this idea of mysticism. Now here's a big figure, Joseph Caro. I don't know how you say this, Shulchan Aruch. So Jewish law in this time, so this is the 16th century, the 1500s. So during the time of the Reformation in the Christian church, you had this gentleman comes along, Joseph Caro, and Jewish law was codified and in a portable form that became the standard reference for later orthodoxy. Okay, so then the second slide on this, Hasidism, now we're in the 18th century. This was a revival movement emphasizing joy, devotion, mysticism, and charismatic leadership it arose within Eastern European Judaism. So that would be the Ashkenazi people. The Jews in Palestine during this Ottoman era, they remained in Jewish communities in the land, though as minorities, and this was long before modern Zionism. Haskalah and emancipation. So the Jewish Enlightenment and political emancipation pressured Jews to modernize and rethink the authority of tradition. So all along this time, things are changing in the world. The world itself is modernizing. Of course, you have the Holocaust in World War II, and that was a terrible time. 6 to 9 million Jews, primarily Ashkenazi Jews, were killed under the reign of Hitler, and that was catastrophic to them, profoundly affecting Jewish theology, identity, and support for a Jewish state. And that led to, in 1948, the State of Israel. And there's also this war that solidified it in 1967, what was called the Six-Day War. So these became defining modern events, especially for Jewish peoplehood, security, and messianic speculation in some circles. In some Jewish circles, as well as, I would say, in Christian circles, moving on from Darby in 1830, who established dispensationalism, and that followed that the Second Coming and the 7-year tribulation could not begin until the Jews were reestablished. And so you have the Jews working towards possible messianic speculation and perhaps rebuilding of the Third Temple on one side, and you have the Christians who were trying to help the Jewish people along to have their own land and to establish themselves, but for the purpose of bringing about the Second Coming, the tribulation and the Second Coming. You have all the way up to modern conflicts between Israel and Iran and its proxies, and it reflects ongoing regional tension with continued efforts to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. So Israel continues to be a very small patch of land just on the eastern side of the Mediterranean, and they have nuclear weapons, but they don't want any of their enemies to have nuclear weapons, like Iran, and they employ the help of the United States and Europe in order to accomplish that. Next slide is modern Judaism. It's the same ancestry, but different answers to some big questions. So there are 4 major branches in modern Judaism. There are 4 main branches of Judaism. You can see the Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, and Reconstructionist. They all come out of the same Rabbinic tradition from the Talmud, but they differ on one key question, which is how binding is that tradition today? Note that there's a column here, believe in God, ? That might seem like an obvious question, like it should all just be yes, of course we believe in God. But in modern Judaism, it's actually not a simple question. Some branches treat belief in God in very traditional terms, while others allow for a wide range of interpretations, some including some that are more symbolic and even non-traditional views of who God is or what God is. So this table can be thought of as a spectrum from preserving tradition to reinterpreting tradition on this end. You can see here that Orthodox Judaism, it sees this halakha. It's fully binding, essentially continuing the Rabbinic system established in the Talmud and in the Mishnah until today. All the way, however you have to interpret it, you interpret it for the modern world. With conservative Judaism, that stays within this system, but it allows a careful adaptation over time. I know in one particular example, of course, on the Sabbath, you're not supposed to do any work, but what is work? In the Old Covenant, work is defined as not reaping or harvesting. There's also some ideas of what it would mean with livestock, but both of those contexts have to do with an agricultural society. So in today's times, if you happen to be a farmer, then you would know you shouldn't do any reaping or harvesting on the Sabbath. But what if you do other types of work? So they have to interpret things like what is work. So like in one case, there's an example of in the Old Covenant or the Old Testament of Abraham starting a fire on the evening before, or in the evening before the Sabbath started, but allowed that fire to continue giving its warmth. And so the conservative definition of that, or analog to that, is that you're allowed to have batteries. So you can't have people working to produce energy on the Sabbath, but you can have them filling up batteries so that the energy in those batteries can be used just like the warmth of the fire from Abraham into and throughout the Sabbath. So that's just an example of how they can interpret and use some of these laws under modern times. So Reform Judaism, and it's called, I had to look to make sure, it's called Reform Judaism, not Reformation or Reforming Judaism, but really reforming is probably a better word for it. It shifts more dramatically, treating many traditional laws as optional or symbolic, and it continues to do that as the culture changes throughout, as technology develops and so forth. Reconstructionism goes even further, viewing Judaism as an evolving culture and religious civilization. Now you'll see a similar pattern here in this column about the Messiah and the temple, that Orthodox tends to preserve the traditional expectations while other movements increasingly reinterpret or move away from them. And even the understanding of God itself becomes broader as you move from here to here. So you can see, yes, they generally believe that a Messiah is coming. Often in principle, they believe that there will be a third temple, to the end, where they usually focus on redemption and repair rather than on a personal Messiah. And generally, there's no expectation at all for a rebuilt temple or rebuilt sacrificial system. Where do Jews live today, and who are they? The global Jewish population as of 2024 is about 15.75 million. In Israel, there's a 7.2 or so million Jews, which is 45% of the world's Jewry. That's a word they use. I thought it was kind of strange, but it is a word that they use. Jews are about 72% of Israel's population. So not all of the people who live in Israel are Jewish, but they are the strong majority, the super majority. In the United States, there's about 6.3 million core Jews, about 40% of the world's Jewry. Together, Israel and the U.S. hold 85% of the world's Jewish population. But there are other large communities in France, Canada, the United Kingdom, Argentina, and Germany, and Russia, Australia, and Brazil. Now, Ashkenazi Jews, rooted historically in the Rhineland area And later in Europe, Eastern Europe, still the largest broad Jewish ethnic tradition worldwide, accounting for more than 80% of the Jews. It does become more and more difficult to specify or identify these exact numbers. The estimates get blurrier today because of intermarriage and mixed ancestry. So it's very difficult for any Jew to say that they are a direct descendant of Abraham, for instance, because those ancestries were lost in the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. And then there's other forms of Judaism that have popped up throughout the world. And so it's very difficult to prove that. Now, Sephardic Jews historically are linked to Spain and Portugal and to the larger Sephardic Rite. And Mizrahi Jews descended from long-established Jewish communities in the Middle East and North Africa. Now, American Jews are mostly Ashkenazi, while over half of Jews in Israel are Sephardi and Mizrahi. Okay, so as we get towards the end of this episode 8 and the end of this series, talk about religious conviction, and the term I came up with was statecraft, but basically it has to do with politics and policies. So here is what I would say after doing the research and doing these 8 episodes on the history of Judaism, that prophecy should not be used as a foreign policy playbook. You will get into serious issues about whose prophecy is right, how to interpret that prophecy, and it's just not a good strategy. States must still judge nations by trustworthiness, moral congruity, and strategic alignment. Support for Israel should not require endorsing every theological claim of modern Judaism, nor should criticism of prophecy-driven policy imply moral equivalence among all regimes. So the question for the states is not which religion fulfills prophecy, but which alliances are morally and strategically sound. So we have this interesting mix of theology and politics, and it really does lead to muddy waters. And it's not just one religion, it's at least 3, right? It's at least Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. But then all of those are, especially Christianity, are fragmented into various denominations and different beliefs, especially when it comes to end time prophecies. And so the idea that we should form alliances based on those things is not sound. It's not a good idea. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be allies with Israel or any of the Middle Eastern countries. What it does mean, though, is that we should still judge those nations by their trustworthiness and their moral congruity and strategic alignment. And that is where, I'm not a politician, so I'm not going to decide whether or not we should be allies of Israel or Saudi Arabia or Iran, if we should go to war against Iran. I am saying that we shouldn't do those things based on end times prophecy. We should do them based on the character of those countries, and what I refer to as moral congruity is how their moral systems that are defined or are product of their religions and their theocracies, but nevertheless, how do those line up from how one lives on a day-to-day basis? The last point I put here is a Christian may reject rabbinic theology while still preferring Israel to openly hostile or destabilizing regimes. That whole part of the world, that whole Islamic part of the world, there's a lot of open hostility and destabilizing types of regimes. Even Iran itself, up until 1979, was quite modern and quite becoming quite Western. And it was after the Ayatollahs took back their power that it became the country that it is today. Thanks for joining me, and thanks for following along with me as I did these 8 different episodes on the history of Judaism. I would say that the history of Judaism after the temple is, in one sense, a triumph of preservation. Rabbinic Judaism kept people intact through exile, dispersion, persecution, and modern catastrophe. But it also represents a long accommodation to the loss of the covenantal center, which was the temple in Jerusalem. The temple has never returned, sacrifice has never returned, the priesthood therefore could never return, and direct prophetic order has never returned. What remains of Judaism is very different from the Judaism of the up until the temple's destruction in 70 AD. And even that was an evolving Judaism as it went from being slaves in Egypt to taking the promised land, to living under the judges, to the monarchy, and then the exile, and living throughout the times of the Grecian Empire and Roman empires. What has remained is the memory of those ancient systems, the laws that can still be followed, commentary by rabbis and sages of the modern era, and survival of the religion, that is historically remarkable. But I would say from a Christian fulfillment perspective, Judaism is not just the preservation or continuation of the old covenant, but the prolonged management of its absence. As for the next series, I believe I will start it next week. I don't think I'll be taking a week off. But the next series that God has put on my heart, it's something that I skipped over when I was going through the history of Judaism, at least skipped over in terms of the details of it. And that is the flood. So the next series is going to be about the flood and all the details around it and surrounding it and different interpretations and things that we can make of it. As is the case with other series, I kind of put it in God's hand. I'm not exactly sure how it will evolve and what will come of it, but hopefully you will join me for that. In order to do that, remember to like and subscribe to my channel, and have a great evening.